Okay, hi everybody. This is our second to last session, is that right? Okay, two more sessions. Any questions before we start? Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today were graphical DSLs and then something called a language workbench. I was playing around with a lot of graphical tools for the last several days, and a lot of them were just plain not working. What I really wanted to do today was take a couple of our examples and walk through creating graphical stuff for them. We kind of did that really shakily with Sirius before. I wanted to show you a couple other types of approaches there. Unfortunately, a lot of the tools, especially in Eclipse, are based on some older support for libraries like GEF, the Graphical Editor Framework, which is an older framework in Eclipse and has evolved significantly, but these frameworks on top of it have not. So a lot of them just won't even build anymore. I tried even running them with older versions of Eclipse, and the plugin dependencies were just not matching up. I just couldn't get it to install. This is actually one of the dangers when you rely on a plugin for something that support for the platform may go away, or somebody who's developing that specific framework may decide, I'm just not interested anymore. I actually did that with one. Am I online here? Let's see if I actually have an internet connection. I just use them as my ping. It was kind of funny when I was going through here and went to the Eclipse Marketplace. A tool that I wrote came up in their default list of things. Let's just see if it does it again, which is odd because I haven't touched this tool in 10 years. I don't know. I mean, it was weird because it's like there's no way for them to know it was me. But when I came in here, is it going to come up or not? Nope. But it was weird because it's like I was going through this pretty quickly, and I'm like, wait a second, was that what I thought it was? It was ANTXR. Answer. This is one that I wrote a while ago. It's built on top of Antler 2 to do XML parsing. So instead of having grammar rules or just rules, you actually have tags for each of the rules, and then how the nested elements are inside the tags, and it does all the parsing for you. It was actually pretty cool. I used it for several projects, and then I wasn't doing XML for quite a while. Thank God. At least not XML parsing like this. And so I kind of haven't touched it in God knows how long. Does the more info do anything here? No, it doesn't go anywhere. So it was just weird that popped up there. But this is actually an example of if you depend on a tool and the person who authored it abandons it. I actually had somebody, I don't know, about a year ago sent me a note saying, where is it hosted right now? Because I had it hosted at Google Code, and Google Code went through this whole thing where they're like, oh, we're not doing that anymore. And so I migrated it, but I don't have an update site set up for it. So you actually have to build it from scratch in order to plug it in. That was a pain. But I don't have that many people asking about it. But it was a neat tool. It's just an example of, hey, things get abandoned over time. I worked with several of these different frameworks just to try things out. I got a couple things working. One of the things when I was poking around, there's a guy who's an Xtext guy who one of his frustrations was a lot of these tools in Eclipse were built on GEF, the Graphical Editor Framework, which is fairly old and really hasn't evolved. It's a fairly niche tool, and it's much more from a programmer mindset than an end user mindset. So it's a little bit clunky to use no matter what you use to generate. And Sirius is built on top of that. So if you remember when we were doing that, some of that felt clunky, not just to develop, but to also use. And we'll see a little bit of that today. So he was looking at some alternatives, and he came up with something called FX Diagram, which is based on Java FX. But it used a different framework called Keeler behind the scenes. And Keeler was an Eclipse framework built on top of GEF and some other things. And some of the parts that Keeler have, they abandoned. And he was depending on some of those parts. So the core for Keeler was still there, but the parts that he depended are gone. So it's like I tried installing this thing and tried finding these pieces, and finally I see these notes on the Keeler site saying, oh, we deprecated this stuff. We just didn't have enough people to maintain it. So it looks really cool, though. I'm going to, if assuming I can actually get the video to load, I'll show you the video of what he did, just to give you an idea of some of the things you can do here that are a lot nicer. But there's really two main modes that I like to think of graphical DSLs in. One is just to kind of show you what you've got. So it could be a preview. It could be something that gives you an alternative representation. And those can be really, really useful just to see what's going on there. Like if you're developing a state diagram, typing in the stuff and actually just seeing the diagram laid out can really help you. Another one where it's really crazy useful is a GUI builder. So if you're doing the GUI builder and only editing the XML or only editing some type of DSL to represent that GUI, getting it laid out so you can actually see what it's going to look like before you run the app, especially when you're on a platform like Android, and sometimes it can take several minutes to actually start the thing up when you run it. Having that preview is just fantastic. Then there's the next step, and that's actually the two-way editing, where you can edit the source DSL or you can edit the diagram itself. And this can be useful, but as you've seen before, and as several of you mentioned, it's really tedious. And sometimes, it gets so tedious, you're just like, screw it, I'm just going to go edit the code by hand and make things easier. Now, hopefully you've seen with some of the DSLs we've done in here that editing through the DSL can actually be easier than editing it through the raw code. You can have a lot less things. You can get some validation up front, and you can actually kind of visualize it a little bit better. Let's see, where was I going with that? So one of the problems with the two-way editing, not just that it can be tedious, because coming up with a good visual, editable representation for a user is really hard, even if it's a programmer. Because a lot of the things, just if it takes multiple clicks to do things, you could have been typing several characters in the meantime. And you're switching context back and forth. You're clicking here, clicking over there, clicking here, clicking over there. And that can be a very difficult and very time-consuming. Not to mention you're going to get repetitive stress injury with your hand really quickly that way. So a lot of times people just go back to the source code anyway. The bigger problem, though, is synchronization. How do you set it up so that you can have your source code and that model stay in sync when the user can actually go to either and edit them? So think about editing the source. If you're editing the source, you have control of what that source looks like. And if behind the scenes that gets translated into some kind of model, like in Xtext, it uses EMF behind the scenes, the Eclipse modeling framework. It goes into that model information, and then that model is changed. The other editor, the graphical one, sees the change and reloads what it sees on the screen. Now think about what that's going to do for a minute. If I have a state diagram and I put a new state in, what does it have to do to update the screen? You have stuff laid out in a certain way. It'll put a new state somewhere, so it just has to take a guess at where a decent place is. If it uses an algorithm to figure out how to reflow it and lay it out, then any edits that you did graphically are gone, right? And that's kind of frustrating. You're like, I just arranged everything and now it's just kind of shuffled all around. So a lot of times it just drops it in and then draws lines. And then you have to go over and move that around so you can actually see what's going on and have the lines make sense. Or choose layout automatically. So the synchronization from source to diagram can be difficult to start with. What if you delete stuff in the source that's in the diagram? Some of it, maybe you're in the middle of an edit. And one of the things with IntelliJ that I'm on the fence about is the way that it autosaves. And it's like, as you're editing, it's constantly autosaving. And I got used to in Eclipse hitting Control-S a lot, but I was in control of it. I could decide where those checkpoints are, where I want to actually have the little builds hit. With IntelliJ, it's constantly changing that. And if you had a graphical view and a textual view next to each other, and you pause for a second as you're editing the text, that text might not be in a valid state. Then what do you do on the graphical side? You have an incomplete model. How do you represent that? Do you assume the user's done editing for the moment, or do you assume, well, wait a minute, I'm just going to keep my old good state until the user hits another good state, and then try to merge it? And if you do that, maybe if that point where you're waiting, they come over to the diagram and start editing it. This gets really tough to try to manage, which is why a lot of people don't try to do it. It is tough to keep these things in sync. Going the other direction, think about that for a minute. If you add stuff to the diagram, where does that text go in the text file? It has to pick a spot. Maybe you just throw it always at the end, right? Maybe you try to say, well, it's kind of in between these two things, I'll put them there. What if you delete something in the diagram that's used in multiple places over here? It is so many different things you have to worry about for synchronization. Part Personally, I think for a GUI builder, if you get a good GUI builder like Visual Age for Java that I was telling you about before, one that you can really wire up well, if you can do that well, I think it's a worthwhile tool. You don't have to do a whole lot of property editing. Like the one in Android Studio, I think it's only worth it to initially grab your stuff and kind of throw it in place and get a general placement, then go over to the XML and actually edit by hand. So there's a little bit of a benefit up front there, but not as much as I think there would be if you just had a tree that you drag things into and then a preview pane, and then just completely forget trying to drag and drop for the editing. I'll go through a couple things in Android Studio just to kind of show you what that process is like and how it's tedious, and it can be very tricky to get right. Just as you, the user, trying to make your UI set up right. But what I'm going to start with here is I've got a couple little examples here of something that a visual representation is actually crazy useful. And this is a one-way visual representation. It's going to go from our X-text grammar to a railroad diagram to show you what this grammar looks like. And if I had known this thing exists, I would have told you earlier because it's really nice. But unfortunately, I just actually found this last night. I was looking through, going, window, show view to try to find the views for some plugins I was testing out. And I stumbled on this. I'm like, what's that? And I'm like, oh my God. So what I did is I went to window, show view, other, and then down under here under Xtext, there's this Xtext syntax graph. I can't figure out what the call hierarchy one is yet. I tried playing around with it and I couldn't figure out what loads it. But the syntax graph is pretty cool. And this is based on whatever your current editor is. So when I switch editors here with different grammars, I get to see at the bottom this little railroad diagram showing me what this stuff looks like. Now, unfortunately, the way the railroad diagram is written here, there's no arrows to tell you which way things are going here, which would be a little bit more useful. But basically, this is saying I can skip a command, or I can do a command, another command, another command, another command, that type of thing. Now, did this have... No, this one you can't. It doesn't highlight in the grammar where it is when you select it. Some tools, if you click inside there, it'll actually highlight the spot in the grammar that you're doing it. So just, go ahead. This one here? Yeah. So if we take a look at the state here, state has the word state, then a token ID, then a token with the curly brace. And then when we come into this section, we have 0 or more actions. So when we come here, we can either completely skip the actions or do an action and repeat, do an action and repeat, do an action and repeat. So it should really have an arrow flowing this way and another arrow kind of flowing back on this to be a better railroad diagram. This is a pretty decent tool, but it's like if they put the arrows in there, it would take this up a notch. And then the next thing, if you click on something, jumping to that spot in the grammar would be fantastic. But it's a hit in the right direction. And it starts to show you some of the usefulness of an alternate representation that's just read-only. You can't edit this, but it really can help you visualize, especially if you have some kind of conflict. You can see how the diagram is representing it and say, oh, I get it. I see what the problem is here. And it kind of lets you break things down. You can also, from this view, go over here and this little save button, export it out to an image file, and guess where you can put it? In your documentation. It's not the best form for documentation, but it's a little bit easier than just seeing the grammar. Yeah?
So what does the state 1 mean that's all by itself?
State 1.
At the top, in the top diagram, you have the command with the...
Oh, this one here?
Yeah.
So that's optional. So this one here, let's take a look at the state machine up here. So that's going to be for the... Well, here's the start state here. Let's come back. So we have event. So it's this guy here. There's going to be at least one state. So notice how it doesn't have the optional going around the bottom. This is one of those ones where the arrows. Yeah, this is one where the arrows would be useful. The arrow on the bottom here, the arrows are going from left to right. The ones on the top are going right to left. At least that's how I'm assuming they set these up.
What's with the shape of the looping thing? What is that supposed to mean?
It's really just supposed to be you can go this way, or after here you can kind of come up here and keep going around and come back. So it's like if you look at this, you really, well, I mean, you could technically see going in here, but if it had arrows, it'd be a lot easier to read. Think of this as having an arrow going from left to right, and then when you're on the top side, it goes right to left. Okay. That's not always the case, though, because if you have an alternative, one has an alternative in here, you'll see like this, one goes up, one goes down. These are a little bit more interesting. Seeing these ones that have some alternatives inside of them. So you can kind of see how it's representing those guys. It'd also be nice if maybe if you could double click on these, it would jump. Oh, hey, look, it went up there. I was thinking that single click should select it up here and double click should jump to the other rule down here. Would have been nice. But hey, I just found something. Yay. So that's kind of nice. You can just jump up and see actually where the definition comes from. Okay. So this gives you an idea of a visual representation that can kind of help you out. Both of these are based on the same model behind the scenes. That's the semantic model that Fowler talks about in the book quite a bit. So you have your text grammar going to that model, which is just a series of objects. And then down here, we're representing those series of objects in a different manner. Make sense? Okay, so that's one that I think is pretty useful. Now there's some other tools. I'm going to go ahead and close that guy out. There's some other tools here. This one here is using a tool called Graffiti. Graffiti is another framework on top of Gef that helps you make an editor for a diagram. There were also several other examples in here for how you could use just raw Gef, which is this one here. How you could use the graphical modeling framework, which is kind of in between Gef, which is the raw stuff, and Graffiti. These are all little steps along the way. Serious, which is kind of like a parallel to Graffiti. They tried all these different approaches to see what sticks. And you can use them to generate an editor pretty quickly. I mean, Gef takes some time. This raw one here, there's a lot of code you got to write for that. But some of these, like, you know, when I was kind of fumbling through Serious the other week, some of those you can actually get a reasonable, simple editor up pretty quickly. But it's, you know, to actually tweak it and tune it and get it into good shape takes quite a bit of work. So the UE one down here is just the normal X text UE for that. And this X properties here is a little property sheet that's going to display, what does it have in there? I think it's just like the definition of the current state, if I remember correctly. So this is using a state machine that somebody else defined. Let's take a look at his state machine definition.
Why are you critiquing this lack of a capital M in state machine?
Personally, I'd make it have a capital M there. There we go. So his is a little bit more complex. It has a little bit of an expression language built into it, but not too much. And he has a state machine that has states and transitions. So he chose, instead of having the transitions be part of a state definition, the transitions are external. I don't know why people do that. I see that type of modeling approach once in a while, but to me, it just feels more comfortable to have the transitions belong to a state, as opposed to every time you want to go look up a transition, you say, take my current state, go look in the transition map, find the transition, find the transition based on the current state and the event, and then go off. I just think it's a lot easier to say, go to my current state, ask him for a transition for an event, boom, off I go. But, you know, hey, to each his own. It's just a different way of modeling it. And you'll see it has source state. He chose a little arrow in between instead of the words that I was using. And he has the event name actually in parentheses as an optional. So you can say that there's a transition without having an event name attached to it. I'm not sure I like that. I would much rather the event name always be there. But I suppose he's trying to set up that, you know, there could be just a default when anything happens, go someplace else. Okay, so let's take a look at, let's look at this other state machine while we're down here. So this one, even a completely different type of language here. We say there's an events section that has each event listed. Then you specify your initial state, and then you specify your states. In this case, he has the transitions inside the state, and the transition looks kind of similar to what that other guy did with the arrow in between there. No actions on this one, just a real simple state machine. So let's run this guy. This session might be a little shorter than some of the others because I was initially planning on actually walking you through coding some of this stuff. but that just doesn't seem like it was really possible. Okay, so we'll take a look at, I'm going to say new, other, and under other, I'm going to pick state machine. And this is using Graffiti to actually create an instance of the state machine. And it's actually going to create two files for us, a diagram file and an actual text file, and keep them in sync. And as you're going to find out, most likely they're not going to keep in sync all that well. I've had mixed results. Going from the text to the diagram seems to work very, very reliably. The other way, not so much. Oh, well, no, there was actually a spot where I saw putting text in didn't update the diagram. So we'll create those two files. Here it's opened up our default state machine, has a little palette. You'll notice it looks kind of similar before. We had this little palette on the side where you have these objects that you can kind of drag in. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the state machine text file as well, and have these guys just be side by side. So in my state machine graph, I'm going to grab a state, drag it over here, and let's call it AAA, hit enter, and save it. And as soon as I save it, you'll see that the text appeared over in the default state machine side. We'll do the same kind of thing over here, drag another state, save it, he shows up. Let's do another one, save it, boom. Now let's draw some transitions here. Boom, da boom, boom, da boom, boom, da boom. Save them, and we have transitions. So that wasn't too bad. If you have something more complex going on, like you wanted to actually edit some information inside here. So if each of these states had more information. If we were doing like, I don't know if you remember when I was doing the hand editing of the EMF stuff, how tedious that was. Let me show you a quick example of that real quick. So if I come into Eclipse Modeling Framework, we'll create an empty project for him. EMF sample. And then inside there, I'll create a new eCore model. And this gives us a little editor that's basically a tree. Note that there's no package name in there, so I'm going to have to come down here and give him a package name. Java 1, maybe I'll give his prefix Java 1, and then a namespace URI, http://javadude.com/Java1. Okay, so now I have this little Java 1 package. Let's create a couple classes in there. So he's an E class and a new E class. This first one I'm going to come in and say he's a person. This second one I'm going to come in and say he's an address. And then for person, I'm going to add a new E attribute. The name of it's going to be name. The type is going to be E string. And then we'll add a new E reference, which is going to be address. The type of him is going to be address. Lower bound 0. Whoops. And upper bound, we'll say -1 so that he can have any number of addresses. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a little icon here that says 0 to star underneath it. And then address, I can have some attributes. Street. City. Zip. Okay. Now how long would that have taken me to write out by hand if I were using a simple little DSL like we did before? I mean, it would have taken a lot less time, a lot less clickety, 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 clickety all over the place. So personally, I find that incredibly annoying. It has some potential for leading people along, but honestly, I think it might be easier is when you add the class, if it just brought up a dialog saying, hey, give me the class name, give me some information, go to the next page, what attributes do you want, add, boom, something like that. But you've probably used UML tools at some point and seen that type of thing. I don't really find it that big a benefit. I like being able to visualize some stuff. And one thing we'll see later when I show you that video is selective visualization of what you're looking at. But editing that way, I am not really keen on. Yes?
You do like is one benefit being able to do code generation in a bunch of different languages?
So
Is that by
using something like this or using a DSL of any type, EMF, one of the things that's really nice is there's a lot of frameworks built up on top of it. And if your basic data tools are using EMF to define your data model, you can have code generators for any kind of languages you want. You can have tools to visualize them as diagrams because they're just using that same model in the middle. It's kind of like an intermediate language. So you code to that EMF language, and then all these other tools can display the data for you. So visualization is fantastic. You can plug in code generators. And in Eclipse, the way that they have things working here, they have this general selection model going on behind the scenes. So that when you select something in a view, it automatically triggers every other view to say, hey, something's been selected. And they check to see if they care about that selection. And if they do, they present it. And they have an adapter framework built on top of that, that each view can say, here's a set of adapters that I care about. The adapter is going to adapt types X, Y, and Z into a format that I know about, and then present it on the screen.
That's how like you have like the hierarchy thing visualized or the list of
So like over here, or you think outline?
yeah the like a class outline. For
So
Java.
yeah, if I came over here and said
You
outline,
switch editors from one Java thing to another, it'll switch them. That's how that works.
Mhm.
That seems-
yep. So this guy here, this outline is keeping track of whatever the current editor is, whatever editor is active. And you'll see as I move around through here, clicking on things, it's highlighting what those things are. If this thing actually had a property sheet defined for it, you'd see the properties come up over here. But if I go to this editor now, he doesn't have an outline. So that's not even defined. But you'll see that the selection's getting tracked down here. This guy at least has an outline there.
The other one is kind of already outlined.
The property sheet? Or this one here. Yeah, it's kind of an outline to start with, yeah. Okay, so, but there's a bunch of common tools like that, and then you can integrate those right into the overall package tree if you had a different perspective defined in Eclipse. Perspective in Eclipse is basically a set of tools designed for a specific type of editing task. So you might have a Java perspective, you might have a modeling perspective. Let's see if the modeling perspective shows anything interesting here. Thought there was EMF modeling perspective. It's just not showing up. Let's see what the graffiti perspective has inside of him. So he's just organizing things in a different way. Here's a miniature view of the currently selected editor over here. So if this thing had stuff all over the place, he just kind of gives you the overall and lets you pan around. There's a lot of shared selection type stuff going on there. Save him. Okay, questions so far? So going from editing to text, we'll see that I've added things in here and they show up over here. If I come up in here and I say add in a new state, DDDD, save it, nothing's showing up.
I thought you were saying that was the direction that worked well.
It did sometimes, but now it does not seem like that's actually showing up. Let's see what happens if I add in another state over here. What's that? Ah, I think I tried that before and it didn't actually help. That just said there was a conflict. Let's try adding something else again in here. So that got added in. I wonder if I reopen this guy. I doubt it. That's what it looks like in the XML form. Isn't that pretty? Nope, that DDD is nowhere to be seen. So, and I don't, is there a, let's see, can I update? Nope. So,
What happens if you delete something?
let's find out. So I'm going to delete him. Save it. Boom! Let's try deleting the other way. Okay, so now he updated. And let's try deleting this here. And now it's completely out of whack. So apparently whoever wrote this had a little issue keeping these in sync. It's not easy. I mean, I worked on a GUI builder that was trying to do some stuff kind of like this, and it was using Gef behind the scenes, so I could actually have containers that represented the layouts and everything like that. And it was neat, but keeping that sucker in sync. Generally, my approach at that point was the graphical representation is the prime editing representation, and it generates code. You're not trying to keep it in sync. There were a few things I tried just to see how I could get it going back and forth, and I was playing around with protected regions and generation gap. Didn't like any of it. It was just gross. So choosing one and then going to the other is probably a better way to go. Starting with the diagram, unless it's fairly simple for the user to edit. If they have a lot of clicking to go back and forth, I wouldn't recommend it. I'd recommend sticking with the text as your primary representation, and maybe you allow people to add things by dragging into the text or something, or hitting buttons to add things, and then show a preview. I think the preview is very, very useful. Now this other question.
Oh, just, I don't know, making a graphical editor for any kind of language you arbitrarily define just is valid. Is there like any other frameworks that just help with outlining the problems with making a synchronization between text and
Well, that's what things like Sirius are supposed to do for you. And it's trying to represent it. It's trying to set it up so that basically what you're doing is creating a mapping between your model objects and GUI objects. So you can say, for a given object, here's how I want you to display it on the screen. For given relationships, here's how I want you to display them on the screen. And it has some potential, but generally, I just feel like it's just too much work for the user in the end. I mean, it's great to visualize something. I like that, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. Yep, go ahead.
Have you ever seen or used Artisan?
Artisan.
IBM, like model-based engineering tool that you're creating models in Artisan, and then that's what it's called.
Artisan by itself is not going to help me. You mean Rhapsody? Oh, importing Artisan. So let's see. It's probably, IBM tends to deprecate stuff. Sorry, functionally stabilize things. That was that was actually legit when I worked at IBM. That was the term. Functional stabilization is end of life for a product.
Maybe that's not what it's called. I remember this, like, every time I come to class, I'm like, oh, what the hell is that tool called that I use?
There was one called Rhapsody that they had, and then there were several sets of UML type tools. And every time I've touched one of those, they can be nice for building a really simple diagram to explain a small part of your application. But a lot of people got into all the tools had this reverse engineering option where you could basically throw a bucket of code at it and then it creates a diagram, a completely useless diagram. And I never found that useful at all. If we can come up with some other way of representing software to help show flows. Now there was something, anybody ever use the data display debugger, DDD? It was an old Linux tool. Is this it? Yeah. This actually was a really neat tool I tried for a little while when I was doing C++ work. And basically what it does is you can start at a given breakpoint, tell it which piece of data you want to look at, and then follow pointers from there. And it adds things to the graph as you follow pointers. And this was really nice if you had a bad pointer in a data structure. You could see it really quickly. And I liked this idea because it was really, you're directing how the diagram gets designed. You can see stuff on the screen. A lot of times when I'm doing debugging in Android, I will hit a breakpoint, look at the variables list in the bottom, jot down some of the hashes of the different variables to say which objects I'm dealing with, and then as I step through, see, am I still using the same objects? This would be fantastic. I hadn't thought about this in years.
It is called
It's just, yeah, it happens.
But it was like a SysML.
Yeah, there are a lot of things like that that unfortunately get discarded over the years because people come up with better ways to do things. This actually makes me think that we should do something like this in Java. Whether it's on Android or Java in general, shouldn't be hard to do, but basically let you walk parts of the heap, from any given breakpoint, walk them along, and then when you hit other breakpoints, see what gets flagged up above. But it was a really neat tool and really helped me kind of visualize what's going on as I was running a program. And if we could come up with ways data flow is the hardest part, I think, of any application. Just trying to get your data flow down. I used to work for McCabe and Associates. Oh, what the hell do we call it? Battle map. Yes, this is a tool that I worked on. And can we see that bigger? Maybe not. I don't know how useful that is. But the idea here, the McCabe cyclomatic complexity, that algorithm was based on linear algebra. And the idea is how many linearly independent paths are there through your code. So what you're seeing here is control flow through a given module, probably a function in this case. And the numbers say which line numbers those things are happening on. And you'll see up here, we had an if statement. Here's a loop that you can see where come into the loop, we can come out, or we can come out of the loop 0 times. So these types of diagrams would help you see how the control flow works in an application. But the biggest argument I had with McCabe, and I sat down with him several times on this, is what about data? His whole philosophy was, first of all, you can't test every possible combination of paths unless there's only 2 paths, right? As soon as you have, 2 if statements, you now have 4 paths. It compounds like crazy. And so he came up with this idea called safe testing. And the idea was to use linear algebra to find the linearly independent paths. So you might have a path that comes down through over here, another one that comes down through over here, one that comes over through here, and one that comes through here, and maybe one more that does a different type of loop, and then supposedly you've done enough to test this thing. Conceptually, I didn't mind that, except for data flow, because what ended up happening is with that loop there, sometimes his test paths that the tool would report would say, go through the loop 2 times, go through the loop 3 times. And I always come back to him and say, what about 0? What about 1? Those can have very different effects than other multiples. And, maybe you're depending on some data who'd been initialized inside that loop. And if you don't skip the loop, you'll never find that bug that you didn't initialize the data. And he'd be like, no, linear algebra says. He was a pure mathematician, and he felt that linear algebra completely explained computer programs. And I think it's a start. I think it was an interesting idea, but you got to take data heuristics into account and what might be happening. So if we can come up with ways of visualizing how data flows, something like that I think would be very, very useful to see, where things are shared between different modules. So anyway, that was kind of a little bit of a tangent. I worked there for 2 years. That was amusing. That was my foot in the door for a compiler company, because when you try to go work for a compiler company, they want 5 years experience, but all I had was my graduate school compiler class, and I was really interested in it, but they're like, well, no, we're looking for people with experience. So I worked for McCabe doing this reverse engineering tools. Reverse engineering, Visual Basic, and Pascal were the 2 languages I was working on, generating the data to go into that tool to put in the graph, and so that gave me some experience to have my foot in the door at a compiler company. Yay, backdoor time. So much fun. So anyway, another example down here. Was this the one? I think this is the one. So this is that other version of a state machine that I was showing you. This one where he has a list of events up at the top, says his initial state, and then has states with the transitions inside the states. This is just a generic editor for graffiti, just to kind of show you what it looks like. Let's see if I can find this one here. So show view, other, I think it's this one. There we go. So this one's using a tool set called Zest, which again is built on top of Gef. Zest is a crazy simple tool set. I'll show you some of the code for it in a minute. But anybody here ever programmed a JTree in Swing or a recycler view in Android, that type of thing? If you've done those, you kind of have the idea of how you can adapt your model to be displayed. The display has certain characteristics, like in this case, nodes and edges. That's pretty much all you got here. So what you do is you define an adapter that translates your model into a series of nodes and edges. Boom, they're displayed on the screen. And this one also has selection, so you can actually select and go to the specific parts in the code. I don't think it goes the other way though. No. So again, I find this a really nice way to visualize. And this guy has a couple layout algorithms in him, so he automatically lays it out. You can move things around if you want to, so you can get a better view. But as soon as you go changing things, like if I came in here and said state step 1A, and we'll say next goes to step 2, and I know you guys love ends. And we'll say foo goes to step 1A, save him. Whoops, I didn't have a foo event up here. There we go. Notice how it relayed out. Okay, so this is one of those things where if you decide your goal is I'm just going to blast it out. If the user wants to temporarily move things around to see them a little bit more easily, that's cool. You can come over here. The way this thing is set up, I can switch to different types of layouts here. So they have different layout algorithms on how it arranges data on the screen. The tree view had ways you can have it be a top-down tree view or a left-to-right tree view. But this gives you an idea of some of the types of visualizing you can do. And in this case, you don't edit it from down here. You're just viewing it. And if you wanted to, it's easy to add an option to, again, dump it out as a graphical file. I think with Graffiti, you can dump it to a vector, like an SVG, or a ping or GIF, something like that. Okay, so again, I think this is kind of nice because it gives you a way to look at what your model looks like as it starts getting more complex. Okay, questions on that? Doesn't let you edit it, but a simple editor for a state machine, if we were just dragging and dropping the pieces down and then had an edge going click, click, edge, have it do a little pop-up. It just comes up and says, what event? Boom, you choose your event and it's up there. That might be an easy way to edit this thing for the users. But then you have the synchronization issues to worry about. Okay, questions on that? So that can be fairly useful. Now what was I saying I was going to show you? I mentioned something and completely blanked on it. Oh, I wanted to go into Android. So here is how a GUI looks in Android Studio. We just have a little XML file. This says I have something called a constraint layout, which allows you to position things and say how they're positioned relative to each other. And then I have a text view in it. And if I look at the design view on this, we'll see that he has an edit area here and what they call a blueprint, which just kind of shows you how the pieces are positioned. So this guy right here, you'll see that he's kind of positioned in the middle with springs on all sides, just kind of making him float around. I'm going to get rid of those constraints on the sides there and then throw in another text view. Let's throw in a button, why not? And let's put in a image view. We'll grab some image. Let's just use that thing, why not? And what we'll do is we'll take this guy, I'm going to constrain him to the edge, constrain him to the edge, constrain him to the bottom of him, constrain him to the bottom of him. This is where it starts getting sticky. You notice how it just kind of went wacko there? Because I slightly missed my target. It's a little hypersensitive. It's kind of like one of the things that happens to me. Whoops. What is it doing there? one of the things that happens often when I'm working with the tree over here is when I go to click on something, when I click, I'm not letting go in the exact same pixel I click down. Nobody does. And IntelliJ is a little hypersensitive and will treat that as a drag sometimes. So I'm constantly having to cancel it, and then I have to go and turn off drag and drop. It's kind of similar here. It's a little twitchy. So if I can get these in the right spots, did it again. So he's got 8 on the top. What does he have there? See, it says he's got 8 up here in the top for spacing, but for some reason it's doing that. Oh well. I think this has proven my point. Oh, now he's okay. Let's see about this one. And then we'll make him go over to here. Let's take this guy. And I'll change him to be stretching, kind of like that. And boom. So you can do some of this stuff to get a pretty rough, fairly simple GUI to start with. But then as soon as you want to start editing, what text goes in this text view, you have to come over here and then find this guy, change the text. Maybe you want to have the text set differently while the tool's running from what you actually see in the editor. You can put something in there. You can tweak the margins up over in here. You can change the way the text is displayed here by picking, different attributes for it. Why is he not showing up there? Seriously? Wow, it's not doing anything there. We'll just do that. And that just makes him bigger. So you can kind of tweak things, but it's tedious and clicky. You have to do a lot of clicks. Versus if you just go over to the XML here, I can come in here and say, oh, change my text to foo. Change my text appearance to medium. Change my constraints. Once you get used to these constraints, they're pretty easy to deal with. It's just like my start is aligned to the start of somebody else or to the end of somebody else. And then you can throw in some guidelines that everybody can bump up against if you want to. The layout's got a lot of stuff in it. There's a lot of code in this. But after your initial dropping down, I don't think the GUI builder really buys you a whole lot. Especially if you want to start adding new components in between things. I think it's much easier once you're used to the way the constraint language works to do it inside the text. I am very tempted, though, to write a DSL for this that's cleaner than the XML. Because there's a lot of stuff in here where you're putting relationships between things, and it's a little hard to see in this because it's kind of spread out with the XML. I think a nice little DSL could do this really, really well. So, but this is an example where you can go 2 directions. I don't think there's any way to see these at the same time, which is unfortunate. Because I would like to be able to say, edit the XML and see the changes in the GUI at the same time instead of having to constantly go back and forth. Well, maybe I can do the preview. There we go. The preview does it. So then inside here, I could add in another text view. And I will say that he is going to be left of parent. His top is going to be to the bottom of text view 4. And then this guy here, he's going to be to the bottom of text view 45. There we go. So you can kind of see how it was changing as I was typing things. I may be in some states where it's not going to be valid, and it might show me some garbage up there. Like if I got rid of that. So it chose the strategy of just keep showing what was previously there as opposed to trying to synchronize and show errors, things like that. But that actually kind of works. Being able to use this as a preview. Oh, and actually it looks like you can probably edit these too. Yes, it's a little bit more than a preview. It's actually an editor. So you can actually see the constraints changing in the text as I do this. So this does some two-way, and the two-way is pretty decent here. It's just, I think it gets really tedious to try to edit this in the GUI builder, especially when you have to be so precise on these things. Okay, questions on that? Of course, I could zoom way in, but then I'm going to have to scroll all the time in order to deal with things. Okay. Any questions on that? So another type of a graphical builder. This is the type of graphical builder that I think is going to be more of a successful graphical builder. A lot of the ones, UML, I don't know how UML still persists because it's just a pain in the butt. I think it's nice for documenting small chunks where if there's a complex set of like 6 classes that interact, it might be useful there. It's a little useful for the basic concepts of design patterns, although with a basic design pattern, you basically almost always have 2 boxes with an arrow or maybe 2 arrows between them, and all of them look like that. Sometimes that arrow is a subclass, sometimes it's just a reference. But pretty much every pattern, I mean, if you looked at the UML, there's no way you can say, that UML is pattern X. You just can't. Unless it happened to say at the top, this is the observer pattern. Then you can say, that's the observer pattern. Okay, questions on that? Yeah, I mean, think about what the observer pattern would look like in UML. A box with a little list inside of it with pointers to other boxes. That's helpful. Yeah. Okay, so that, I think, GUI builders are the ones that are the most successful versions of graphical DSLs right now. Doesn't mean they're good. I mean, honestly, the last time I saw a good GUI builder was Visual Age for Java, and that's 18 years ago. Almost 20. I mean, it was like right around 2000 that IBM canned that environment. And I missed it. I mean, that's, my GUI builder was very much based on how they did things. The more official ones for Eclipse are, there's a company called Instantiations that used to do plugins for Visual Age for Java. I knew these guys really well. They made me an honorary member of their team. Actually, I have a good story about them. They were run by a guy named Alan Werfs. He was their CEO. And he married somebody named Rebecca Brock. And I don't know if you've heard Rebecca Werfs Brock. Does that name sound familiar? She came up with, there's several types of OO design methodologies, and she came up with one called CRC cards, class collaboration or class responsibility collaboration. So the story that he told was when they got married, they wanted to hyphenate. And traditionally, you hyphenate with the woman's last name first, and then the man's last name, which would have meant their last name was Brockwerfs. And they thought that was a little too close to Brockwurst. So they decided, we'll just do the other way around, Werfs-Brock. So that's where they came from. But great group of people, really brilliant people. They came up with a GUI builder for Eclipse, but it was based on protected regions for how they did code generation. And that was one of its bigger failings. The GUI builder itself also, the only things you could do in it was just put the GUI pieces down like this. Any wiring had to be done through code, which you have to do through Android, the same type of way. Oh, by the way, one of the biggest failings on this is when you want to try to do data binding. The data binding, you have no choice but to do it over here. You just can't do it in the GUI. There's no way to do it. So think about this. I mean, if you come up with some ideas for ways to visualize things that are useful and easy for the user, as soon as you have to start going click, 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 you lose. If you're going back and forth between a property sheet. But if you can come up with ideas on how to visualize something, I mean, first of all, your model has to be fairly simple. But if you come up with a good visualization for it, that could really be helpful to people. But it's hard. I mean, it's really hard. Now, we saw that that Android application builder tool. What the heck was it called? That one with the little Lego blocks that I was showing you before? App Inventor, thank you. So we saw that where the idea was to try to make it more approachable for people who aren't programmers to do some programming. And that was actually started for, I can't remember if the Lego Mindstorms was the first place they used that, or if there was another tool before that somebody was playing with. But Mindstorms really kind of pushed that idea. So kids would build these Lego robots, go in, drag these little blocks, which basically had really simple coding logic, put them together. You can also code Mindstorms in Java, which I think is a much more effective way to do it. You could not then. Back then, your only choice was that little blocky language. And some people got fairly good at it, but it's kind of clunky. And it was the type of thing that I don't think it abstracted away the programming stuff enough to really be a big benefit to view it visually. Maybe if you were having them draw a flowchart instead, that might have been easier, because instead of having this little block that has an if with two little things underneath it attached for the then part and the else part, you could have a block that says test this thing, go here or go here, and you get a little bit more of a visualization on it. Flowcharts sometimes can be useful that way. The one diagram that I find incredibly useful is a sequence diagram. I think that, I don't think I have one. Let's see. Whoops, that is not the right place. Let's go into there. Modules. OneDrive. And no, I'm not using SVN. It has been a long time ago. Well, that's a lot. And before that, SCCS. It's like, no more. Let's see, Recycler View, I think. Why are you taking so long to open? That was weird. There we go, I found one, yay. So this guy, the sequence diagram, I find this really helpful to visualize things. I don't necessarily think it's great to do it line by line for a function. There are some tools out there that will generate these for individual functions and try to show you. I like to look at it more from a conceptually what's going on point of view. And I think this can really help somebody take a look and say, now I get how these different things are interacting. I get what this flow is doing, and I get how these three objects are doing the job by passing data back and forth. So this is like the one type of diagram in UML that I think is really worth something. Of course, the most useless diagram, in my opinion, is the use case diagram. I never understood the point of that. It's like, oh yeah, you have this, and then here's the things you can do with it. It's like, why not just write that down? It's a bulleted list. I mean, do you really have to have a little person in there or a little computer picture? It's like, I don't know. I wasn't keen on that. So anyway, this is one type of diagram I think is pretty useful. Unfortunately, coming up with a way to take this and generate code off of it is tricky, unless you're so detailed on this that you've pretty much written the code already, right? Going the other way, maybe. But I haven't seen a lot of tools that generate these that really make it that useful. So it's like just trying to visualize what's going on is something that, one of the things I used to do at IBM, I had a tool that I wrote, this is back in the early 90s, before HTML. They had this tool called Bookmaster, which was kind of like HTML for generating documents. And it was nice, but a little clunky. So what I did is I wrote some parsers to parse comments in my code and generate Bookmaster so I could generate documentation. And some of what I was generating in there were basically sequence diagrams. They weren't, UML wasn't really a thing yet. And so there was still some concepts floating around about it. But diagrams similar to this were around. So I had it generating sequence diagrams. I had it generating a couple other types of things. Railroad diagrams I was doing at one point too. And that can be kind of useful. But again, it was starting from a textual representation, and I was using the graphics as just an output to help explain. So sometimes that's useful, but generating directly from code, not really that sold on it. Okay, questions on any of those? Okay, so those are a couple things you can do with tools like Eclipse, where they have some frameworks that you can actually build graphical stuff. The one that I mentioned a little earlier, where did I put that? I think this is it here. Yes. So this guy here, what's his name? Jan Konlin? I think something like that. He's a guy who's worked on a lot of stuff with Xtext and done a lot of blogs on it. And he came up with this tool called FX Diagram, which is using Java FX to draw things. And You can't really hear him. I'm gonna go ahead and let him talk, and kind of tell you what he's saying a little bit here. I should probably just mute him. Can I mute him? Nope. Oh, there we go. Now I've muted him. So what he's doing here is he has this diagram editor using FX diagram, and this, you'll probably remember, is our wonderful state machine that Fowler came up with. Personally, I really hate this state machine. I mean, I understand what he's trying to get at, but it's a little clunky for the example. A little bit more than it needs those codes in there and all that stuff. So what he's doing here is he is saying, I'm selecting some element in this and saying add it to the diagram. So in this case, he's taking one that doesn't immediately throw everything at you. It lets you selectively navigate. So from that angle, it's a little bit more like data display debugger, where you're choosing what you want to visualize and how you want to see it. Then from there, you can use these little arrows to say, I'm going to navigate to something else and add to it. So again, very similar to data display debugger. I don't know if that was his inspiration behind it or if something else struck him, but I think it's kind of useful. And so now he's going over there, he's going to add in a new transition there. And I don't know how it's actually choosing what's going on there. It might be totally random, just for a demo, I don't know. But then he had it set up so it automatically flows out. So you can see how things go. And I think this actually came up as a pretty nice looking little diagram there. Where it gets interesting is when he starts editing things over here. So what he's going to do here is take that guy and comment it out. And you'll notice how over here it got ghosted. So he has some smarts in there watching the model and then updating that view to say some stuff is no longer valid. And now he's going to do a resync up here, which just removes that event. Still have the connection, but the event itself is gone. And now he's doing a little undo to get that back. And I believe he's going to comment out a state in a moment here. So he takes that out, and we'll see that the state got ghosted and the transitions got ghosted from it. This is pretty useful to kind of show you how things are mapping. And this one I really wanted to show you live. I tried to get this thing working. This is the one that we're using Keeler behind the scenes, which is a tool that INRIA in France came up with. And they started deprecating big chunks of it because they didn't have time to work on it. I think it's, research projects like that, that'll happen quite a bit. So they ended up going out there. But this kind of shows you another way of taking a look at data and visualizing it. And this is a pretty nice looking visualization that he has there. Let's see. There was another one that had some stuff in it that was kind of cool. It might be this one. So again, he's using Xtext here with a different kind of DSL. This is like just a model of people. And he's adding some components on there. And what is he going to do next with this? Oh, he was just showing how when you close out the model, it actually stays up on the screen there. I think this is the one that I think it... Yeah. So he has a different type of visualization here to let him choose the different ways the different things that are potentially linkable. So, coming up with a good way to represent things so the user can navigate quickly and easily, this actually might work pretty well. And you'll see how it actually hooked up to that address over there using the link because it already existed. Here he's going to actually add a little nested diagram by using the company. And when he double clicks on it, poof, it shows you everything inside there. Now I have seen several types of tools that will let you navigate through packages that way. I despise tools that insist that a package means anything other than the way I want to organize my code. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a library. A lot of tools kind of assume that a Java package is a library and that everything in there should be friendly and protected from the outside world. I don't like using a package bound as the library bounds. I think package ends up being just too big. And that's originally what they intended with Java, so that friendliness stayed within the package, package protection. Over time, as we got more and more code, organizing your code in packages based on how you think that pieces should be grouped. Like in a framework where you're displaying in a framework where you're what would be a good example? I completely blanked on where I was going to go with that. How we're breaking things up into packages. If you were doing something that was displaying a GUI, you might want to have one package for your fragments in Android, another one for your activities, another one for views that you have in there, maybe another package for custom views or something. Just some way of representing it that makes sense for you to organize your data, as opposed to here's the stuff that play together. For me, that's more the module, which has several packages underneath it. So sometimes having that package and then saying, oh, let's go inside the package and see it, you're going to have so many links outside of the package, it's not going to be really that worthwhile. So coming up with a good visualization is tough. Okay, so questions on those? Yes?
Package is just like grammar, not like a Java.
Oh, and there, what he was doing, he was actually using it as kind of a Java package to group things together, and just saying, here's a group of things that belong together. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a library or not a library. I mean, I would, the way he was doing it there is he was kind of nesting his packages, so it created these little bundles of stuff. But chances are really good you're going to have a lot of things coming in and out of that, and just zooming into it isn't going to be that useful. It's kind of the whole reverse engineering thing. Here, stuff on a screen, way too much. A friend of mine used to call it reverse inundation instead of reverse engineering, which I think was really applicable because we ran it against pretty much any normal project, and you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of classes, and especially if you're generating code. And that's another problem. When you run these tools against generated code, think about stuff like the generation gap pattern, where you're sticking classes in the middle that are generated. If you're looking at that on a diagram, you probably don't want to see the generated code, but then you lose a connection between what the superclass is and the subclass, right? So it's one of those things. It's like, I'm generating tons of code. Like in my main project I'm working on, I generate about 60,000 lines of code, and I have about 40,000 lines of written code. And in that 40,000 lines, the stuff that it generates, a good chunk of that is builder code and DSL code to generate all that other code. I don't want to see all those generated classes anytime I open up something to look at it. It'd be too much to deal with. Okay. So any questions on any of that? So the next thing I want to show you is a tool called MPS, and this is called a language workbench. It's a different way of looking at a DSL. And what I wanted to do here, I was starting to think about, maybe I could walk you through actually coding one of these. But then I remembered all the times I've tried and what a pain in the butt it is. This tool has some potential, but I don't like it. The reason I'm going to show you things in here is because it has some interesting concepts and different ways of representing data. But editing the code inside of it, I think, is very, very clunky. It just doesn't feel right. And the reason for this, most of what we've done all our lives for programming is edit a text file. We go in there, we change our text file, and then we run something that compiles it, transforms it into some other type of model. This tool uses what they call projectional editing. You are not editing a text file. You're editing a projection of a model. It's kind of like having, a graphical representation, except it's text. But as you're entering, it basically gives you little boxes to fill in to say, here's what can go in these different spots. So if you start entering a for statement, it spits out the entire for statement with some blanks that you have to fill in. And you have to kind of tab around between them. Sometimes you have to use Alt-Enter, sometimes you have to use Enter, and it just feels clunky. Whereas, I would just type a bunch of text in fairly quickly. This one I have to kind of jump between fields. But there's some advantages to this. If you think about what's going on behind the scenes in a tool like this, I'm editing an abstract syntax tree. It's just a model behind the scenes. And as I'm editing that, it can present it in any number of different ways. You can present it as a graph, you can present it as a table, you can present it as text. And you could say parts of this might look different than other parts. Parts might appear like text, parts might not. And because it's a model behind the scenes, now any other tools can use that model and put up different views. So you can have several different views on the same data at the same time if you wanted to. I'm going to start with a fairly simple one here. This is a little Robot Wars type game. Well, it's actually just a robot that tries to find a marker. And let's see if I can bump the size of the fonts up here a little bit. And I don't think that's going to help the side stuff. Oh, it does. Good. Okay. I don't care if you recommend it or not. I'm going to do it. Maybe 18. How's that? Is that decent? Okay. So what they're doing inside here is we're defining a language, and these little S boxes here are sandboxes, basically places you can kind of play with the data, create your program to execute. And down here, we're defining the languages. So the first thing that we need is the structure of our language. And they have it broken down into several packages. And each of these is describing a concept. You can kind of think of a class. Wow, that's tiny. Is there any way I can change that? There was another thing. Did you see it somewhere? Or? Oh, there we go. Thank you. I did, and it should have found it. Well, that's a little bit better. Not great. But notice how each of these has kind of a little spot to fill in. So it's basically a form that you're filling in. And you can say this guy is going to implement an interface. He's extending a certain type. I can hit Control Space for my content assist. I can type in a description. And because this doesn't actually matter, it's just a string, I can just type in whatever I want there. He can have different types of children. In this case, he has, direction. And I have other concepts that I'm dealing with. So this is kind of how you define your classes. They're all just little forms. Then you define how you want to visualize those using an editor. And you have an editor for different types of things, like let's see, a heading editor. And notice how it has this little cell layout described here. So you're basically defining a template for what the user is going to use to fill in their data. And here's another one here. These are all super interesting looking. That one's a little bit more complex. And this is talking about how it generates code for it as well. Wow, that's actually quite a big thing there. And then we're going to describe things like what behavior these objects have, any type of specific type constraints I have on the system, other types of constraints here, actions that can be performed, any runtime code that I'm going to pull in. I think this is just Java code here. Yeah. And we use these in our sandbox. So in this sandbox here, I'm defining a cell, direction, frame, just some Java code. This one here I'm using to actually define objects using those forms. So we'll see right here we have some common functionality for a library that has some little subroutines. Looks kind of languagey. If I come in here and I hit enter, I can use Control Space, and you see it's giving me these little places, little spots to fill in. What types of actions I can take. I can do a step forward, I can do a turn left. So I can kind of pick and choose pieces to put together. I can choose them using Content Assist and build things up. Let me get rid of that so it doesn't, whoops. I don't want to have that in there. Okay, so this gives a little algorithm for the robot. This is another different algorithm here. And let's see, how did I run this thing? There we go. So this one is actually, it defines a little robot here, and he's walking around, and it looks like he's just dropping numbers. I think this is going to kind of be a Minesweeper type application, but I'm not really sure. Let's see what this guy does. So he's going to try to use his little algorithm to try to find that little mark, and boom, he found it, and he wins. Took him a little while to realize it, though. So, what's that? He does a little dance at the end. He's just spinning around. I think it's just he does his check at the end of his spin around at that point. So this is a different way of representing a program or representing data. It's kind of a form definition language. And I'm really on the fence on trying to edit this because it just seems like it takes so much more time to click through to enter this stuff. And when I was trying to define the DSL for one of these, I was basically trying to do a state machine a while back, and it was tedious as anything. I mean, Xtext, it's quick. I mean, you can define a DSL very, very quickly, all textually. But again, this you're editing a model behind the scenes. So whatever you enter, it'll only save stuff that's valid. Okay, let's take a look at another one here. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. So we're talking projectional editing here. So it doesn't have to be text. You can display things in different formats. You can put them in different positions. So here we have something that looks kind of mathy. Now, I mean, not ideal, but they're trying to give an idea of some type of thing you might do here. So we're defining different types of expressions here and then printing the results out. So we basically have a combination of what looks like code and what looks like mathematic expressions or matrix expressions. A little on the gross side, but you get kind of an idea out of something like that. So this one here is a state machine. It's basically a workflow type thing, but instead of representing it as code, we're representing them as tables. So we can say here that if my state is open or closed and my events are these events, how do I transition between them? This might not be a bad representation for somebody using a workflow tool. I mean, there's much better workflow tools out there that have custom forms and everything, but it gives you kind of an idea of some of the type of things you can do with this tool. And in this particular one, I can come in here and say view is structural, and now I have a different view. So this is where I'm using that same model behind the scenes to represent my data in two different ways. And this is actually something I wanted to do in a tool a while back using Eclipse, where in some comments you could describe a decision table to say, based on these conditions, here's what I want to actually have done. Because depending on how complex your logic is, sometimes a decision table is a really nice way to look at it. And this one here, it's kind of a decision table. It says, here's my current state, here's the conditions. And in this case, the conditions are just single events, but it could be a complex expression up there. X and Y, X, Z, whatever. Or maybe you're just saying X, Y, Z, and based on those three, what do I do? Based on what their values is, where do I transition to? Sometimes that might be useful. It kind of came down to, I was like, well, I don't think it comes useful up that often to be worth the effort. And trying to keep it in sync. If there's some kind of tool that automatically synchronizes what's in the comment as a decision table and the actual logic, with a tool like this, you don't need the synchronization because it's kept track of as the model behind the scenes, and you're just presenting it to the user in different ways. So they can edit the text by hand, and then if they have a complex expression and want to see it as a decision table, they can just switch the view like this, and poof, they see it in a completely different way. So this, I would actually like to have something in a language like Java or Kotlin or C, C++, whatever, something that can take your code and present the logic in a form more like this, if possible. It's not always possible. I mean, sometimes it would have to have these nested tables, which would just be forget it. But I mean, yeah, what I'd really like to do is for any given method be able to present a decision table to say what happens based on these values of the data. The problem is once you're inside one piece of data, sometimes it changes values for other things. So you can't always cleanly say that. But when you have one of those big old if blocks that is checking X and Y, if X is null and Y is not null, otherwise if X is not null and Y is null, otherwise they're both non-null, something like that, having a little table to see what it really means would be really helpful, and be able to flag, hey, you missed a spot. There's something you didn't cover in that. Because anytime you have those, when you have two things you're comparing and you have to worry about, is one null, is the other null, are they both null, are they both non-null, sometimes you miss something. I just did that this morning. Okay, let's see what else we had in here. I think there was another one that might have been interesting. Oh, guess what this is? DSL book example. I wonder what that is. So if we take a look inside here, that looks familiar, doesn't it? So they're doing it now in this tool. If I wanted to add a new state, I hit enter. It's giving me that little form. I can hit control space. He has no suggestions for it, so I can just type in whatever I want. Blah. And tab is not going over there. How the heck do I do it? Just enter. Alt enter. Blah. Now tab worked. There we go. And then foo. Wow, wasn't that exciting? And then down here, I have trigger to target, so I can choose foo and idle, something like that. So it gives you a little bit more of a form-based editing, but as you could see, I was getting frustrated just trying to type something in, and it's a simple thing like, what the heck key do I push here? I'm trying to hit enter. I'm trying to hit tab. Nothing was working. It just feels a little clunky to me. There's some promise to some of these ideas, especially with the whole idea with the table and being able to switch back and forth. That I think is when you talk about projectional editing, that I think is the real benefit. If you can have multiple meaningful ways to represent your data and be able to edit that same model behind the scenes, that's useful. Maybe one of those ways is a graphical diagram where you're dragging circles around, drawing new lines between things, and then you switch it back and forth. As opposed to trying to keep the text in sync with the diagram, each of them is just directly editing the model behind the scenes. And then when you switch over, it reloads from that model. So you really can't get out of sync. So there's some possibilities there. But it feels clunky. I don't think we've quite gotten to the spot where this type of stuff is really that useful. Yes?
I don't know, it just reminds me of like code snippets in Visual Studio, where you put text templates and tab variable and it fills out at multiple places.
Yeah, that's we have that in Eclipse too. And templates, the code templates I think are really useful. They had a when I was first teaching Android, actually when I was doing what was it? When I was doing the patterns class as well, I was using the snippets view in Android or in Eclipse to define the templates, and then as I'm editing, I would just double click on the snippet to paste it in to show the next step of the way, rather than having to type a whole bunch of stuff. Now sometimes what I'll do is just use git and just go different checkpoints. Sometimes that's useful. But the other thing we can do new class foo Java. I just hit Alt Enter. I meant to hit Command 1 or Control 1. So if I now go to Preferences, Editor, Templates, I can come in here and let's say that I wanted to have a getter, public, was it $, type get dollar name and then return this dot, and this is going to be a little on the awkward side because there's as far as I know with this templating language you can't say do the first letter uppercase kind of like we could in expand or xtext, I mean. But when you have something like this, then I can come in here and just type getter and have that in there, type in string, start typing in the name, boom, does stuff like that. So that's actually pretty useful, and it's fast too. I mean, it's not as clunky as it was in MPS, and it's one of those things. I think a tool like MPS is a good midpoint to something. There's a lot of tools that it's like by themselves I don't think are going to be useful, but sometimes they spawn other thinking, and that's where it's useful.
They had just done like, here's a recommended snippet based on your grammar. Choose which snippet you want to do.
Yeah.
You chose rather than just automatically dumping something.
Yeah, I think the big key is trying to have a fluid flow of how you're doing your editing. Because when you're doing text editing, you can keep moving at your pace and and things just go and you keep going. Now, maybe I'm not giving it a fair shake. Maybe if you get used to it, you can get to that point. But it just feels like there's a bunch of spots where it's like I'll do something and then it just kind of stops. And then I have to go and click something or I have to do something else to get into the next spot. And it just doesn't feel like it flows during the edit process. And that's kind of my biggest beef of it right now. And on top of that, one of the other big problems, when you have something that edits a model like that, and it's proprietary, and the same thing holds for EMF. You know, we're doing xtext. There's a very specific model behind the scenes. You're locking yourself into that model. The less goo you have on the top of it that you had to enter, the better. With xtext, I think xtext is a fairly thin layer of goo. So the stuff that you have to type in, that grammar, is fairly minimal. And if you ended up having to switch to a different tool, I don't think it's going to be super, super painful. The big thing you're going to have is if you had a lot of code generation, that becomes trickier. Now, I showed you a little bit of the model inferencing stuff in xtext, where instead of writing a whole bunch of templates, you use code to say create a class, create a field, create a getter, create a setter. That I think locks you in a little bit more than if you use the raw templates, because the raw templates you can just change it to be a different language fairly easily. With the inferring stuff, you're locked into Java as your back end. And so I think that's one of those places where I switched from the templates to the inferencing, and I regret it. It did some cool things for me because it took me a little less code to generate stuff, but I'm very bolted into Java at that point. I can't switch it over to Kotlin. I can't switch it over to maybe generating a different DSL that gets run by somebody else. It can be a lot of work that way. But the visualizations, I think, is the hard part. And there was this big push for a while on case tools, computer-aided software engineering, which UML is a type of case tool. The idea was to try to make coding more like an engineering science. And personally, I don't think coding is a science. I think it's an art. And when I went to Michigan, computer science was actually taught through the School of Literature, Science, and the Arts when they first started it. I think it's in the engineering school now, which is technically where it belongs. But I liked going through LS&A because I got to take other classes like Dinosaurs and Other Failures. That was a fun little one-credit class. Class on dinosaurs, you'd think it would be easy. There are more than just those 6 dinosaur names that everybody knows, and then 2 others that we learned from Jurassic Park. There are a buttload of dinosaur names, and they get tough.
You were obsessed with dinosaurs as a kid?
Oh, I was, but there's only like 5 or 6 dinosaurs you ever learn when you're a kid.
You go check out the dinosaur books at the library and go through the hundreds of dinosaurs.
I mean, most of the books you get as a kid though only have the 5 or 6. Triceratops, or is
Simpson's Guide to Dinosaurs or something.
yeah. I never got that hardcore. My grandson, who's 3 now, it's like he loves dinosaurs, and I got him some dinosaurs for his birthday, and he calls the Triceratops tops. He loves the tops. I told him that was my favorite when I was a kid. I had a weird dream as a kid one time where I must have been 5 or 6, and I was at my grandma's house, and we go outside, and a Triceratops is attacking the house for I don't know why, just banging its head against it, and then out of nowhere, a bunch of plumbers come out and start banging on him with wrenches, and then I woke up. It was a weird dream, but anyway, there's some potential. I tend to try to recommend if you think there's a good way to visualize something as a preview or as an assist to the text, go for it. And if it's not going to cost you a lot of time and effort, I mean, using something like Zest. Let me, which one? Is that the right place? Yeah, down here. This was the one that had those little circles for the state diagram. So this guy, this is the view class that we have that defines that actual view area inside Eclipse. So there's basically some stuff up here that says I'm activated whenever the editor changes. And when the editor changes, I'm going to go ahead and get the xtext content. Here's my information to draw the graph inside there. So this basically is just called anytime that document changes, I'm going to redraw the graph. When I switch the layouts, there's a little menu that switches to layouts. If I select an object in the graph, I want to go and tell the editor that I've selected it. Not much else in this one. These guys get a little bit more interesting. This defines the actual figure for a state. So we're going to have an ellipse that's drawn. Real simple stuff just to say what I want to draw on the screen. A label provider is used to either put labels on elements or inside a tree or inside a list component. So he's basically just a way of saying, pass me in something I want to get the text for and return the text. Not a whole lot else there. And then here's like, how do I get the figure for it? I'm either going to use a state machine figure or I'm going to draw a line for it. And the content provider is where am I getting the data from? So the data that I want to display. Then I have the things that do the layouts. Boom, done. Not much code there at all. I mean, Zest I think is nice for, I did one when I was doing the design patterns class. I used to have people writing Eclipse plugins. And so we would write in Eclipse plugins. One of them was using Zest to display the dependencies between different projects in your workspace. And they actually have a tool to do that now that's actually pretty similar to what we wrote. But it was so little Zest code. I mean, it was probably 100, 200 lines of code at most. And it would go through and say, for all the projects in my workspace, look at all of the projects they're associated with, create the nodes for them, lay them out, boom, you had this wonderful tree of all the dependencies in your workspace. And that's something that I used for, not just as a class example, but also at my previous job where we had like 40 different projects in that made up our overall tool that we were working on. And it was great because you could see very visually, oh, hey, here's a spot that everybody's coming in and going out of. Maybe we want to refactor that more. Or there's something over here that nobody's using anymore. And you got a real good visualization on it just very, very quickly. But this is one that, if you can find a tool like Zest and you want to just display a graph, I mean, this was all of, maybe 300 lines of code to do this. Very nice way of doing things. But when it comes down to, hey, I want to create a graphical editor for something, think long and hard about it. It might not be worth the effort. I mean, if you can get something like Sirius to work and give you some real simple starters, just, drop a couple states down and draw some lines, might be nice. But if you're trying to do anything more complex, it just might not be worth it. Okay. Yes. Graffiti is a different one. Let me see what his code looks like. I played with him a long time ago, so I can't quite remember what it looked like, but it was in this guy, this one here. Now the guy who did this example did everything in extend, which is that that language we used for using the templates in there. So here's the wizard for creating a new state machine. That's a ton of code, huh? Here's for the creating a new project. It's a little bit more complex. This is the one that created those two separate files, the state machine text file and the state machine diagram file. And it looks like a lot of what's in here is just comments. Here's a page in that wizard for creating one, because those two pages for creating the files are almost identical, so he just created that page once. Now we didn't have any creation wizards on the GraphViz side or the graffiti side. No, the Zest side. We just had the diagram. This one's going to be a little bit more because we're creating these wizards and things like that. And this is an editor. So here's a guy who's going to be updating the state based on, let's see, so he's going to be rereading it. Is that what he's doing anywhere here? So I'm not sure what an update context is. I'm assuming something else is saying, hey, the model has changed and sending the change list down through. I believe this tool, what he did behind the scenes was use EMF compare, which takes an existing EMF model and another EMF model and figures out the diffs between them. And then you can just use those diffs as a set of, here's what I want to change. Not a lot there. Direct editing is typically when you double click on something to actually, like in this diagram, I double click on something and it popped up a text field for me to edit the name. So that's what this guy is doing here. This is for creating a transition. So this is, you have this create connection context. When you come off that menu, it gives you the little thing that looks like a plug, and you click on one element, then click on another element to draw a line. So what we're doing here is just saying, are we allowed to start a connection on the element that I'm hovering over? Can I create the connection on the target? And then this actually creates the connection between them. I'm actually remembering some of this now. This is for creating the state. So when you choose that tool to create the state, you're going to draw that rectangle and say, boom, here it is. And this looks very similar to the other one. I'm not sure what the difference between this and the create transition feature is. There might be something on this. In some graffiti diagrams, you have an option of where is it? I thought there was that sample in here. I don't have my nested one up anymore. Huh, why is that not showing up? Come on. That's interesting. Why is that? Is this the one? Yeah, here it is. So in this one, you'll see that when I float over here, it has this arrow. So when I click there, it actually can start to create a connection automatically if I just drag off of it. That's probably what it's talking about, is that feature. And then, oh, I remember what this is. So these create ones are actually creating the objects. The adds are how it actually gets added into the actual model behind the scenes. And then these ones here are how we're actually setting up the GUI. So these are going to be the features that are allowed to have. So there's going to be the create state feature, create transition. Those go in the palette. And then this guy here is going to state diagram type provider. I'm not quite sure what this guy's doing. Typically when you see things like add adapter, it's saying what do I do with selections. So when something is selected, how do I interpret that as something else? So I can add in an adapter that says take this and make it look like something else for me. But I'm not sure if that's what they're doing here. So a little more code here, but we're also doing editing. And not terribly well. It kind of worked, but not great. Yes?
So are those classes all like, are those extend files auto-generated? Or did you
No, this is somebody wrote all these.
write it?
Yeah, these ones, there wasn't any type of generation on this. Now for the stuff that we did in Sirius before, which I think I got something kind of hacking and working before, didn't I? Let me close this here. We can open him up. Oh, I think there's some stuff in there I might have deleted. Oh, he's still running. I don't want to have that running there. I think there's some pieces I have missing. But the stuff that we did in Sirius, there wasn't. I wasn't editing it inside here. I was editing it inside of the target workspace. It was in this one. Oh God, this stuff again. I think it was this thing here. Yeah, this was the one that had the little tree editor up at the top. I don't think I'm going to be able to run this right now.
It's not looking positive down below.
No, not at all. I think I may have deleted it, or deleted parts of it. Yeah, I'm not seeing it in here. I think what happened is I actually removed I removed a lot of the plugins when I was trying to get things to work. I was adding plugins in, and they were pulling in dependencies, and then I wiped it clean and started with a new clean one. So I don't have that available. But for doing that, there was like a little tree view that I would go in there and pick the different types of components I wanted, and then say how I wanted to map them to graphical elements to display on the screen. So there are things saying that I have a shape that I'm going to use for my state, and then lines for the connections. And that did it mostly declaratively and generated a okay-ish graphical editor for real basic stuff. But you ended up with a lot of stuff in the property sheet that you had to enter. And that's just kind of, it just feels clunky to me. Now, if somebody's not a programmer, if you can set up a set of tools where the programmer works on the code behind the scenes, and then somebody else does the GUI. So if we could have a separation, and I don't think the tools are good enough to do that right now. Like in Android, I don't think I could throw a graphical designer at the XML and say, go at it. But if we could come up with a way of representing the GUI independently of the code, and maybe have them draw the GUI, but have a nice way to represent that with the code, like what you guys are doing for your GUI builder, having those getters. So behind the scenes, it generates those getters, and then you hook your code up in the subclass. If you could do something kind of like that, it might kind of work. Because if somebody's not a programmer, property sheets aren't too bad. If it's for us, if we can go and just type something really quickly in a file, it's much easier, right? But if you're not a programmer, you might not have that as an option. And so you might be fine with, oh, okay, I put this frame up here. Now let me change the color, change the text, change the button, and so on, something like that. Then it might not be that bad. But every GUI builder I've seen isn't geared that way. They're always geared for programmers, where we create our GUI and then we edit our GUI. But hey, there's a task for you guys. Come up with a GUI builder that non-programmers can use. So you can throw a graphic artist at it. It's much cheaper to have a dedicated programmer and a dedicated graphic artist than somebody who knows both. And I'm not great at making a pretty GUI. And I know that. That's not my bailiwick. I mean, I can do an okay one. I can do okay looking stuff, but if you want it to look really nice, bring the graphic artist in to tell me what to do. And then I'll tell them they're wrong. I did that once. I really pissed a graphic artist off. It's just like, well, why are you even using me? I'm like, it still has to fit within the platform you're doing. You can't just completely go, you can't make Android look like a Mac. It'll do nobody any good. It's similar like an iPhone. You don't want to make an Android-looking app on an iPhone. You want it to look and feel like an iPhone app. That's really important. So, okay. Let's see. Was there anything else? I think those are the main things I wanted to cover today. So getting some feel for graphical user interfaces on there. Focus on making them as a view more than an editor, because they're usually simpler to do, and I think there's a pretty big bang for the buck there. If a graphical representation is meaningful, like that state machine, I think that's very useful. If it's a diagram of people, I don't find that super useful. Oh wow, a little person with name IDs. There's actually, that's still recording? Yeah. There was actually one that guy did. Hello? I don't think that was it. Under here? There he is. This one was actually kind of cool. He was actually setting it up kind of like a little LCARS interface using the same type of tool. And I can't find his source code. I wish I could find his source code because it'd be fun to just kind of play around with something like this. But this gives you another way you could look at different types of data and flow between data. And in this case, it had kind of a fun Star Trek-y type feel to it as well. Did everybody hear that Patrick Stewart's going to be in a new Star Trek? Yes. Okay. So, but anyway, you kind of get the idea of you can do different types of things visually to mess around with your data. Querying. Well, that's kind of neat. So sometimes a visualization can help you understand your data. There actually are tools. What's the name of that tool? Starts with a P. It's for data analysts. I am blank. What's that? No. I thought you said pointless, which I would say, it was pretty pointless, but oh man. I'm blanking on it. I used to have to work with it, and it's you drop little objects representing people on there and then draw lines to say, here's a relationship and add data in a relationship. It's kind of, what you'd expect to do for, a data diagram. But it was more intended for non-programmers. And it wasn't Paradigm. I am blanking on it. But it gave you a way to look at data and try to analyze relationships between data. But again, it just felt slow. Like you had to do so much clicking around to do anything that, personally, I just didn't find it super useful that way. Okay, but I think that's all I really want to talk about on these things for today. Any questions on anything?
I remember a question I had about the bookmark.
Mm-hmm.
Do we, I'm going to assume no, but do we care about checking
Oh no, that's a validation you could add in. So we should still have that same support already there. So you could have that expression to validate names are unique, but do some other things.
No, that wouldn't be like a validation. I mean, in like there's like that
Oh, I
validated
see what you're
stuff that I
saying.
could go through and say, are my names unique?
Yeah. Actually, that would probably be a good idea. I mean, when I'm testing this, I'm not going to be messing around with it anyway. But to do that, nope, not a Java project.
It creates a stub for you with the validator. We talked about that.
Yeah, let me just point out where that is real quick. I might as well use their default stuff there. So inside here in the MWE2 file, there's this guy down here. If you just uncomment him, that'll make sure that all your names are unique through the file.
Name.
If they're named name, yes. Anything named name, it makes sure they're unique. I think if you nest things, I'm trying to remember if nesting still forces them to be unique. Let's try something here. So let's say the model is going to have a bunch of types. And then we will say a type has a name and stuff inside of it is more types. Oops. Let's do this right. Oops. No, actually, I do want to nest it that way. And let's do this. And we'll definitely need to have a delimiter there. Otherwise, that is completely ambiguous. Let's try that. And we'll run him. And I can't remember if they have to be globally unique or just unique within a scope. That's what I'm checking right now. Actually, I think I can say that's not it. I thought there was a wizard that it created for it. I just can't remember where it is under here. What was this called? My DSL1. New file foo dot my DSL1. And yes, I want to be xtext. And so let's say type A, type B, type A. It may be scoped. Yep. So it's definitely scoped, which is very useful. You can in xtext define custom scopes though. So if you wanted to, you could say inside here, where can I get valid values from? In this case, it's probably going to allow me to have this A, this B, or this C down here. Oh, I didn't have any actual references to them. I just had definitions. Yeah, so it'll allow you to have the same name inside a nested scope as a default rule. But that's nice because this sets that check up for you. It's a custom validator that's attached. You don't have to write any code for it, as opposed to having to write the code inside here, which you could do, but you don't have to. You can just uncomment that. Just make sure after you uncomment it, you rerun that MWE tool. Otherwise, it won't do anything. Okay, any other questions? So hopefully the homework will be fairly simple. I know some people have turned it in already. I may do something a little different for it next term. I'm not sure. I would really like to have people try some kind of a graphical or alternative representation. Um, it's just most of the stuff that's out there just is not good enough yet. I mean, you think by now somebody would have come up with a good thing, but I mean, a lot of it is just the concept, coming up with a good concept for how to alternatively edit something other than text. And for a lot of things, there's just not really a good way to do it. So, okay. Any other questions? Maybe there'll be like a spoken interface at some point, or like Minority Report. You just wag your hands around in the air and things just happen magically. That's what you can do. Just generate a tool that randomly generates stuff as you're moving your hands around, and have the user try to figure out how to make it do that, and it's all random. They think they're doing something. I must have done it differently. It's like, no, it's just random. Okay. Well, have a great week. I will see you next week for the final class. Not going to have a final. If there's anything in particular you guys want to talk about, let me know. I'm trying to figure out what content I want to use for next week. But if there's any specific content, yeah.
You tried like filling the Orion ID, like the web IDs,
I think I did that once a while back, just to kind of play with it. And it's most of the stuff you're doing in the editor here you could do online.
does it give you like the source code to Orion so you can then extend it?
As far as I know. Now there's some, depending on what you're using, like I think Gef is a problem there because I don't think Gef can actually go on Orion. There's another tool set. What was it? Shoot. There was an abstraction. I was just reading about this one. There's an abstraction on top of a graphical layer that you could either use on the web or you could use in the IDE itself. I can't remember if Sirius was the one that does that. I'd have to look again. I'm not sure I get the utility of having having the your application be online like that.
When you're making standard line of business applications for anyone, it's usually like web application. If you're like a coder, you just make something that plug into the line of business application. I know I've got
Yeah.
like a million use cases that I want to do exactly right now.
Well, then that works. I mean, I haven't tried it, but and I haven't really heard a lot about it. But there are definitely some people who are really enthused about it. And I think at one point I looked at something. It was either an early version of Orion or it was whatever was before Orion that they were working on, and it basically looked pretty much like an Eclipse RCP application just on the web. And it's just for me trying to get my head around a good use case for it, because it's like I tend to look at web applications and desktop applications as having different reasons for being. Although with dynamic web applications now, things have gotten a lot more blurred, where you can edit them, and we're working with JavaScript and dynamically replace the HTML. Although sometimes sometimes it's really easy to get lost in that. And there were other tool sets I had looked at, like GWT, the Google Web Toolkit, where you basically are coding Java, but it generates JavaScript for use online. So it kind of felt like you were writing a GUI, but then it had JavaScript running. And there just was such a big disconnect between the Java and what the JavaScript was that conceptualizing it was really tricky. It didn't really catch on. But that'd be worth playing around with. I don't know that it's really a topic for this class so much. But I mean, if I see something using some technology like that would tie in with this concept, with this class, that could be useful. But no, I haven't really done much with it, other than I think I tried a little tutorial a long time back, and it was a while ago. So, but yeah, if there's other topics you guys want to talk about, or things that are related, give me a yell. I can talk about that, or I will find some other topic. It's like 12 classes is a lot. I like most of the content that I've covered. Last week, I really liked the lecture last week. That one felt good. I like it when I come at the end of the lecture and I'm like, damn, that felt good. Hopefully you guys felt the same way. Okay, well, have a great week.